thank you for inviting me here. It's a little odd for me to be coming to Villanova to be talking to you about Augustine. It would be like me inviting Brett down to UVA to talk about Thomas Jefferson. There seems to be something ontologically wrong when this is done, but I'll allow you to pretend, and I will pretend with you, that I have something to say on this. But I do want to thank both Brett and Mark and the whole ethics program for having me up here. It's really wonderful to be up at Villanova anytime. I've been coming here and directing my grad students here for various things, Augustiniana, for about 15 years. And it's always nice to get back up and see old friends and make new ones. So what I wanted to do today is really give you a kind of quick go-through of how I construe some interesting stuff about Augustine as someone who might be interesting in a generic class on kind of introing people to ethics, introing undergrads in a liberal arts, liberal studies program, basically to be thinking about the moral life. So in some ways, this is not necessarily understood as a disciplinary focus. This is not the way that, say, a philosopher would teach an ethics class or a theologian would teach a moral theology class, but in some ways it's a class about thinking about ethics within not so much the confines or structure of a discipline as much as within the world that we inhabit today, with the many ways that theology, philosophy, political theory, political science, psychology, economics, what have you, shape and inform us and raise ethical issues and concerns for us basically 24/7. My reading of Augustine's ethics, while of course it is the obviously correct reading, is in many ways individual and idiosyncratic, and I'm glad that you have multiple people coming because you'll get a sense of the range of people and approaches to doing this. And so I would encourage you to take what I say very seriously, but with more than one grain of salt. Furthermore, this question is really useful, this topic of how to think about ethics in some way in a supradisciplinary manner is especially useful for someone like Augustine, because in so many ways his own work and his own thinking is so profoundly orthogonal to the ordinary ways that people today in ethics programs formulate things. I have myself witnessed people calling Augustine a eudaimonist, a virtue theorist, a deontologist, and I've occasionally seen people in political theory circles talk about him as a consequentialist. The fact that his work can seem to fit so many of these categories, or seems to straddle so many of these categories, suggests something both about Augustine and perhaps about the actual ontological status of these categories themselves, at least as we've confabulated them. But what's interesting about this is that in thinking about Augustine, it means that we actually have to do a little bit more work, I think, to connect what he's doing to our typical received ethical categories and formulations, and in ways that are illuminating both for those categories and for thinking about Augustine. We uncover interesting things about these categories in trying to figure out how they might relate to someone like Augustine. And that is in some ways the first question, the first point I'd actually like to make here. I've been coming to things at Villanova on Augustine for a long time, and in every situation I've been here with Father Tom Martin, with Father Alan Fitzgerald, with others, there's always a situation where someone asks a kind of pretty fundamental question, and you can see the person who is the kind of focus of the conversation think about how to answer the question. And it turns out that there's never actually there's frequently no direct answer. You have to actually take a couple steps back because the question itself has embedded within it certain assumptions that a lot of what Augustine is trying to do is going to try to question, undo in some ways, and re-thread in a different way. And that's important to remember about him. He's not fundamentally, and this is a mistake I think it's easy to make, not fundamentally an academic, not fundamentally someone who thought of himself as formulating a philosophy or a set of doctrinal positions. Much of what we take to be first-order work of Augustine thinking about an issue will be, say, for example, a letter he wrote on what it means to see God. Or a letter he writes to, say, one of the military authorities in North Africa about how they should conduct themselves in military actions. But we actually effectively take things that are in some ways Augustine's emails and treat those as if they are fully fortified, footnoted academic treatises. Also, even the texts that we centrally take to be primary objects of serious study, the Confessions, De Trinitate, the City of God, texts like this have an enormously complicated setting and audience and rhetorical strategy that needs often to be understood in relatively specific ways before you can begin to get at what they're about. All that is to say that when you find Augustine quoted somewhere, and as you see, I handed out a tissue of quotations of Augustine, you have to be alert to where Augustine is coming from in those texts, because it's easy for him to say multiple things that sound quite in tension with one another to multiple audiences. So that's all just to say that insofar as you want to teach Augustine in a class, it's often useful to have a little background in the actual text just to figure out what's going on in that text, who he's talking to, stuff like that. Tom Martin of blessed memory here at Villanova convinced me a while ago that, in fact, we have for about 1,500 years been looking for Augustine's political philosophy in entirely the wrong place. We look for Augustine's political thought centrally, most famously, in the City of God. We do that because it's such a big honkin' book, right? It's a massive thing, and so clearly he's going to have most of his political thinking there. Tom actually made the very good point that if you look for a successful political community in the world, for Augustine, what you want to look at are his monasteries. So you actually would be wiser to look at the monastic writings of Augustine to think about what politics should be. Or, secondarily, to look at his sermons, the sermons to the laity, about how to be a Christian in the city of Hippo, or possibly in Carthage. And look there. The City of God is actually an enormously complicated and dangerously tripwired text, which can mislead you in all sorts of interesting and complicated ways. Again, I said that my reading of Augustine is idiosyncratic, and so this is one of those places where I think it's usefully idiosyncratic to think about whether or not we have been, in fact, missing some of the central stuff on Augustine's political thought. I think we actually have. And Tom Martin, again, was the one who convinced me of it. All that is to say, then, that Augustine does stand in interesting and distant relation to a lot of our concerns. That said, however, Augustine is also weirdly of use to us in interesting ways. You'll sometimes hear people talk about Augustine, our contemporary, and people talk about how lively he can sound, how interesting he can seem, how pertinent some of the stuff he dealt with is to us. I actually think that's very true. It's easy to treat Augustine as an archaeological artifact, but I think that's a big mistake about him. For example, it seems to me that one of the themes of 2050 is, how do you live in a pluralistic society? How do you live in a pluralistic world, and in some ways live in a world of pluralism where that pluralism has actually seeped into yourself? I don't know about y'all students, but I know that my students typically come into, and I teach a big intro ethics class as well, they typically come into class with a variety of pieces of various ethical theories, various ethical approaches. Sometimes a sense of needing to have a sincerity in your acts sits alongside some sense that the ultimate moral value of an act will depend importantly on what the act accomplishes in the world. And that will all sit alongside some sense that that sincerity has to come sincerely from some proper disposition of earnestness inside you. So you get people who have kind of half-baked deontological, consequentialist, and kind of virtue theoretical approaches coming into your classes. And that's okay, that's the world we live in. We all have that. We all have these multiple moral imaginations, these multiple moral repertoires, moral vernaculars. Augustine did too. And in any of his texts, you will find multiple conversations going on at once. At the most basic level, a conversation among different rhetorics. If you think about the City of God, there's a huge battle, and I'll talk about that a little later, between a certain kind of Roman axiology, which is centered around the value of glory, a certain kind of immanent glory, and a Christian axiology, which is centered around a language of misericordia, mercy, and humility, and peace and things like that. So there's very interesting contrasts, even at the rhetorical level, the level of vocabulary. But more deeply or more immediately than that for us, Augustine actually encourages, it seems to me, a careful reading of Augustine, my reading of Augustine, encourages a real attention to and a patience with the reality of pluralism in terms of philosophical or theological views in the world, in our audiences, and in individual people. First of all, pluralism is contingently real for Augustine. It's a fact of his world that he is in a situation where there are multiple people of very different theological and political and philosophical views. Much more so, for example, interestingly, than Thomas Aquinas. For all the common statements about Aquinas being able to handle pagan virtue and stuff like that, it matters, to my mind, significantly that Augustine had tried to be a pagan and failed at it. That was never actually a live option for Aquinas. And so the vitality of an actual pagan culture is something that for Augustine is something he has to take account of. But it's also the case that pluralism is not just a contingent fact of his world. There may actually also be a theological, in-principle view for him of why Christians ought to be able to understand and articulate their own theological views in the setting that they are, not just to people who are different from them in order to defend themselves against them or to convince them that they are right, but rather to get clear for themselves about what they believe. There's an old pattern, there's an old habit in Augustine and elsewhere of paying attention to the idea you get in 1 Peter of always being able to give an account of the faith that is within you. And Augustine, throughout his work, even in the most boring catechetical work he does, his theory of catechism, is always pressing on the idea that an intellectual obligation inheres in the Christian life. There is an intellectual character to this. There's a wonderful essay by John Cavadini entitled Simplifying Augustine, which is in a book I think called Educating People of Faith. And Cavadini makes the wonderful point that most late antique, or most actually pre-medieval, maybe even medieval, but he focuses on late antique, patristic Christian thinkers typically write sermons which are for mass consumption, and elite philosophical theological texts which are for the Gnostic, right? And I don't mean that in a complicated, I mean just those who know, professors. And that they keep these genres of writing relatively distinct. There are commentaries, there are treatises, and then there are sermons to the people. Cavadini makes the point, which I think is a really interesting one, that Augustine actually seems in his sermons always to have a moment where he says, no, you have to be a theologian. You have to do this. You have to understand this. You may not be able to read, but you have to understand that the journey you're on, the journey of Christianity, is one that requires intellectual oomph for you. And at the same time, if you look at the crucial moments in a number of his more highfalutin texts, and most famously at the end of De Trinitate, he comes back again and again to the idea that the true theologian ends up like a little child. You have to begin all over again. You have to start right at the beginning, right? So there's a weird way in which Augustine is running against a profound tension in his culture to say that the elites can worry about one thing and the masses can worry about another. And Augustine says, actually, both have to worry. They have to get in the position of the other group, right? The learned have to become the inducti, the unlearned. And the unlearned have to understand themselves as, in some sense, called to the vocation of those who are learning to wonder. So there's an interesting tension there and an energy driving forward Augustine in articulating in a self-conscious way for Christians what they believe and why they believe it. This gets me to why Augustine is so interesting on what we call critical thinking. This is another bit of rhetoric in the 2050 syllabus proposals that I've seen, and you know I don't necessarily. I come from Mr. Jefferson's University. Critical thinking there is one of our many idolatries, and so I'm suspicious of the rhetoric of critical thinking. I'm not against thinking or hard thinking, but there's a weird self-congratulatory dimension to critical thinking, I find. And so I just put that out there. That's not bad about this, it's just for me. And I think Augustine I think Augustine has or would have some skepticism of this rhetoric. Our inquiry, as I read him, especially in Confessions but elsewhere, is always already formed and shaped by traditions or various inheritances. There is no ultimate sense where you can strip those inheritances out and assess them in some entirely hydroponic way. You can't rip out your epistemological framework and assess it. You always need somewhere to stand, right? Works like On the Usefulness of Believing or even The Teacher have something to say about this. And against the academics as well. The kind of radical skepticism that he critiques there is a very interesting text. Yet this doesn't mean that we have to be mere stultified acceptors of whatever people tell us. There is a way of being self-critical if the traditions that we inherit generate for us the kinds of intellectual and moral energies that would allow us to be skeptical both of our own understanding and of the concepts, the very categories that adhere to us. And here I will stop doing this soon, but here again, believe it or not, the work of one of my friends, one of your colleagues, Kevin Hughes, on the liberal arts in Augustine is really quite wonderful on this. Thinking about the complicated way that the artes liberales, this is his version of critical thinking, the kind of ambiguous position that holds in his mind. He doesn't want to give up the energy of thinking, but he wants to be very careful that you absorb what it is to think without absorbing certain kinds of problematic, misleading, misorienting rhetorics that will tell you that you can buy into certain pictures of the world too quickly, too readily. Now this is important because, and here we come to our first quotations here, Augustine actually does a really surprising job of subverting his own authority in different moments. In this first text, which I won't read to you except to say the last little sentence, the first text is a good example of this. This is a sermon by a bishop in which he says, this is 3 lines up from the bottom of that, I get angrier with that kind of fan of mine who takes my book as being canonical than with the man who finds fault in my book with things that are not in fact at fault. It's an interesting way in which he's saying, you want to treat me like I'm some sort of demigod. And this is an extremely dangerous thing to do. Right? Remember that, ironically, the same things that made 5th century audiences squirm about Augustine's Confessions are making some people who read the Confessions today squirm, right? Augustine actually sometimes reveals maybe a little too much in the Confessions about all sorts of things. And not necessarily like sexual things, but he has dreams about music and food, and he's troubled by this. So there's a way in which the kind of revelation that you get in the Confessions is extremely destabilizing for the sort of authority that a late antique authority was supposed to have. But that's part of his rhetoric. It's part of his aim. He really does want you, not so much as my guy Tommy J would say, kind of to think for yourself, but to be skeptical of humans as bearers of authority. Not to be dismissive of them, right, as Tommy J would want you to be, except for him, but rather to understand that bearing authority is a little bit like bearing a cross. A certain kind of cruciform structure adheres to being an authority. He doesn't think that you can't be authoritative, and Lord knows he's authoritative when he needs to be, when he thinks he needs to be. But he wants to make sure that no one ever confuses the icon with the thing that the icon is supposed to direct you to. Now that's one dimension of this. The bare fact of the necessity of human authority creates for Augustine an anxiety and a concern that we always understand that we need to direct our appreciation of that authority to what the authority is representing for us. And part of the preacher's task, part of the teacher's task, maybe itself, to always be creating a kind of disquieting self-subverting, which enables other people not to simply take notes, right? This is the thing. In an ethics class, it's so frustrating. People will often just sit there and take notes on what you say. And you're like, that's not the point. I mean, the point is to you start thinking about this, to argue this, right? I actually have now in some of my classes taken to planting one of my students in there who will say increasingly outrageous things until someone finally contradicts them. I actually recommend this as a device because it then creates a kind of sense of, oh, well, if we really ought to find ways of disagreeing with each other. For many of my students, and I would assume for some of your students, the the struggle to get beyond politeness is one of the most difficult things to do. And that's because they're terrified that if they aren't going to be polite to each other, if they have to recognize actual disagreements, then in some ways they've sundered any actual relationship to the other person, right? So one of the best things you can do is this is my proposal to you, but you do. One of the best things I think we can do is to offer people outrageous views that we seem to hold, and then teach them to learn to disagree with us. And to teach them that doesn't mean, that's not a soteriological disagreement in some important way, right? There's no ultimate, there's no way in which I would anticipate a student, I mean, there are some things you could say, you know, John Adams is better than Thomas Jefferson, perhaps, Thomas Aquinas is better than St. Augustine, different settings, that would drive someone out of the classroom. But short of those things, I think it's very important that we try to teach people how to be genuinely frank about finding disagreements, reaching disagreement. Reaching disagreement can be one of the hardest things these guys do, because so much of their lives, so much of their thinking is coated with a kind of Teflon that lets stuff slide off of them. Anyway, so that's Augustine as the bishop, telling his congregation, you don't believe me just because I say it. Right? The second one is, and I won't quote this either, this is a wonderful passage from the first book of the Confessions. There's an intrinsic mystery at the heart of the cosmos itself, a mystery that absorbs and ruptures, breaks apart each of our categories. And this is, for my money, one of the best Augustinian disquisitions on God that you get. But it's intentionally framed in such a way as to break apart each category as he comes to it. And I think that that's a really important thing that he's trying to do. He's trying to show us that the world itself is always going to be, in some sense, up ahead of the language we use, our understanding of it. And so, critical thinking, something that we would think of as analogous to critical thinking, an ever deeper thinking forward, is part of what the Christian life, the intellectual life, not just the intellectual life of people like us who wear black turtlenecks or anything, but the human life involves. In a way, and I ate out on this article for a couple years, in a way, the entire story of the Confessions is a story of someone learning to begin. Remember, the very last word of the Confessions is aperietur, which means will be or shall be opened. The book, the Confessions, which would have, of course, been a codex for Augustine, it would have been something that people read aloud, but the book ends and is shut on the word, then it shall be opened. Right? And what is being opened? The book of life. Knock and you shall find, seek and you shall find, ask and it shall be given. That idea is there at the end of the Confessions. This idea that in some sense, conclusion is actually only the beginning of a new stage of inquiry. One of Augustine's favorite passages in the Psalms, which suffuses both Confessions and then even more importantly his book De Trinitate, is Psalm 105:4, seek his face always. This idea that in seeking understanding, your understanding is then opened up to a deeper level of mystery, which creates a new hunger, which goes ever further down into an endlessness, a bottomlessness of this. For Augustine, at the end, I always think the endings and beginnings of Augustine's books are always so interesting. At the end of the City of God, there's this long discussion of the kingdom, the eschaton, as a Sabbath day without an evening, a Sabbath morning without an evening. The idea of an endless day, right? When we think of Augustine, we think of rest, we think of stopping, we think of cessation and closure. But actually, Augustine's rhetoric is frequently trying to show us that that longing for cessation may be actually a kind of fallenness about us, maybe part of the way we long for death. Right? That in fact, what God may be wanting on Augustine's reading is for us to keep going in ways which we're quite terrified about. So let me go on here to some of the basic ideas that I think are really important to him. And I start, when I think about Augustine overall, I do start with his Theological Anthropology. And that's that first quote on the bottom of the first page. Famously, this is the beginning of the Confessions. And most famously, that last line, you have made us for yourself, and our heart is unquiet until it rests in you. This is, to my money, one of the most important statements Augustine makes about the most foundational statements of his overall picture. The true home of the human is God. The root there is the reformation of our desires, their transformation, or their return into what they should have been all along. To my money, and I won't spend much time on this, this suggests that the categorical distinction you get sometimes between nature and supernature is not one that's very powerful in Augustine. The natural turns out to be the supernatural, latently. It's waiting to be transfigured, it's waiting to be, in some sense, brought into what it should have been all along. Furthermore, the language in the 2050 proposal about human flourishing, this is very important here. Human flourishing is not simply a matter of ethics, it's a matter of metaphysics. It's a matter of theology. Moral psychology cannot be adequately described without recognition of and inclusion of the theological longings of the human. Now, I take this also in political ways. I think that what Augustine is trying to say here is that in some basic way, humans want to adore things. Humans want to worship. And we do. We worship things all the time. Some people worship the San Francisco Giants. Some people worship the Democratic Party. Some people worship the Republican Party. Many people worship America. And where I live, many people worship Thomas Jefferson. Humans want to worship. And any anthropology that does not involve, recognize, incorporate into itself the bare fact that humans are out there seeking things that they would be willing to lay down their lives for is an inadequate anthropology. So one of the things I try to do in my classes when we talk about economics often is you have a picture of the human that's often built around satiation. That the human has basic needs, they want those sated, and then we go on. And if you explore that a little bit, and you try to kind of bring in a leaven of what if there's something more that humans want? Why do we want so many nachos, right? Why do we want, if we only want satiation, why are there people who are overweight, right? Why are there people who are pathologically malformed in these ways? Alcoholics, people like that. It looks to be that there's something more in the human that is never fully, it seems to me, satisfied with enough. We often have moral psychologies that are built around the notion of enough. It may be the case that there is no enough for humans. That there's an infinitude of longing that desires an infinitude of God. You can see how this would be enormously illuminating for patriotism. For any kind of structure that allows the human to construct a story where they can understand it, that it would be good for them to lay down their lives for this thing. Even the notion of humanity itself can be such a God. Anyway, that's my thought there. And also this, I've already mentioned this, but this language of unquiet and quiet, the restlessness and rest. Probably the best person after Augustine to do this, and if you get a chance to use some of his stuff, it's fun, is Pascal. Pascal's notion of divertissement, of diversions, the ability we have to avoid doing our homework for one more Xbox game, the ability we have to not turn off the computer but to look on Facebook one more time, even though it's like 11:30 at night, as it was for me last night. This reality, it seems to me, the restlessness of the human heart, is again a dimension of Augustine's moral psychology that is immediately apprehensible to people today. I mean, you don't have to go anywhere to actually make that visible and palpable to people, right? I mean, Bruce Springsteen had it right. Everybody's got a hungry heart. And if you don't find the right thing to fill that hunger, you will fill it with other things. But the problem is those things will be unsatisfactory, and so you will keep trying to fill it with thing after thing after thing. There's a wonderful theological work to be done on the kind of longings that Facebook seems to represent or express in humans. Anyway. And again, ironically, I will stop doing this eventually. I really think that as for undergraduates, often there are pieces of Tom Martin's book, Our Restless Heart, which is really wonderful on this, and exploring this idea of the restlessness of the human as a central fact that needs to be taken account of. Now, this idea, though, that you have made us for yourself and our heart is unquiet until it rests in you, I think it actually has two kinds of important theoanthropological implications. On the one hand, and this is number 2 here, it implies the cosmological sovereignty of God. God is primary, the primary actor, and in an important way, God enables our action. This is Augustine trying to make sense of stuff like St. Paul saying, "It is not I, but Christ in me who lives," right? If I do something good, it is not me who does it, but somebody else in me, in some sense. And this passage, famous passage in the Confessions, "Grant what you command and command what you will," is, of course, the famous moment in the Confessions where Pelagius, on hearing this text read in a villa in Rome, in one of these auditions of the text, he stands up and walks out. He says, anybody who says this cannot be a proper Christian, right? Because what it suggests to Pelagius is a kind of slavishness, a complete subservience of Augustine, and a refusal to admit any kind of individual responsibility on his part for what he has done or what he has come to be. And so, thus begins, in a complicated way, the famous Pelagian controversy, which haunts Augustine for the next 20 or so years, until he dies, really. But I stand with many others who think that Pelagius misunderstood what Augustine was trying to say, or didn't understand it deeply enough. Augustine was not trying to eschew responsibility for things there, but he was trying to say that human agency is always enabled and empowered by God. There's a complicated story here. Probably your best bet for making sense of this story is to talk to Jim Wetzel, who's here as well. But it does require, thinking about this and thinking it through, it seems to me, does require a really radical reformulation of the idea of moral agency and the picture we have of ourselves as fundamentally self-starters. Now here again, I don't know about Villanova students, but at UVA, there's a profound works righteousness aroma about the students, a profound attitude that often manifests itself in deep anxiety, that they have in some sense deserved all the many good things they've got. I don't know what the average income of a typical Villanova student's family is at the University of Virginia. The average income of the typical UVA undergraduate's family, do you remember this number? Over $100,000. That's the tip. These are clearly people who've made it on their own, right? The incoming class at UVA, over 90% of the incoming class are in the top 10% of their high school classes. That kind of accomplishment and that kind of scripted accomplishment throughout their lives creates for them, anyway, a sense both that it's impossible that they could fail, in some sense unthinkable that they could fail, and also a profound rhetoric of merit and worth, because they know that in some sense they've been fortunate. Along with this very ugly culture of self-accomplishment, it seems to me at UVA anyway, is a profound culture of volunteering. I assume that's here as well. And I think they work in tandem. Like the one is in some ways the guilty conscience of the other. There's a sense that they know they've got it good, but they want to find a way of demonstrating that they can earn it in some sense. Augustine's notion here of the cosmological sovereignty of God is not an appeal for the wealthy to relax, but it's an appeal to selves to recognize that everything they have, and this was always the kicker quote for Augustine when it came to debating Pelagians, everything they have from God. What do you have that you have not received? Right. For Augustine, everything you have comes from God, and thus your first response should not be possession of it as your own rightly given due, but gratitude for the gifts, right? Including perhaps your especially acute intelligence, your gift with foreign languages, your skill at numbers, all of these things that we may possess ourselves, actually for Augustine turn out to be, even in their most intimate things, gifts. Right? In the Confessions, Augustine says, God is more inside me than I am. And that's the kind of statement that he wants to, interior intimo meo. That's the kind of idea that he wants to get across here. This requires, I think, a reconsideration of all sorts of languages of moral achievement and moral heroism and excellence. Instead of a language of moral accomplishment, what Augustine is offering us, and he gets this, I think, through rereading St. Paul and through Paul's rereading of himself as an exemplar of Christ, The human, the admirable human, is the human who is continually confessing their vulnerability and their brokenness, and the fact that they are held up by a kind of graceful mercy, and a willingness to communicate that graceful mercy to others. So I think that the language of heroism, the language of the achievement of virtue, these languages actually are really quite troubled in Augustine's thinking in interesting and powerful ways. And you see again and again Augustine offering the example, especially in a text like the City of God, but also in the Confessions and in his sermons, the example of people undergoing suffering as the example of, as the exemplary model of what it is to be a virtuous person, not someone who does something per se. Just an interesting rhetorical shift for him. That's one sovereignty. That's the cosmological sovereignty of God. Another is the psychological sovereignty of love, and that's on the second page here as well. And these little quotes are famous quotes around love for Augustine. My weight is my love, right? A basic statement. In other words, where my love is, that is what I am drawn to. Those things I care about enthusiastically are those things that I'm going to actually be engaged in. Love and do what you will, controversially, right? This statement that strikes a lot of people as absolutely insane, and also behind maybe the 1960s. And then this very moving, we follow not by walking, but by loving. Imus autem non ambulando sed amando. This great line in a sermon of his, right? Always wonderful to have. But for me, the most interesting is the second one. All the virtues are forma amor. This is a really interesting statement that actually gets taken up explicitly by Aquinas. And this is one of the few places in the Summa where Aquinas actually disagrees explicitly with Augustine. It's a moment of incredible theological honesty. And it's maybe a little sick, but I actually can get teary thinking about it. But what Augustine is meaning here is that the moral virtues, the Roman virtues, right, are actually better understood as forms of love. Now, what does it mean to be a form of love? Love is not something that you proactively do. I can love you, but the phenomenology of love, it seems to me, and I think I'm reading Augustine on this, it's not my importation, is that the experience of love is the perception of the actual value of the person before you, or the thing, right? I can love a book, but in some ways it's not me projecting a kind of erotic attachment to a book. Well, for me, many times, it in fact is projecting an erotic attachment to a book, but that's because I'm an academic like you guys, and so you'll give me that. But the experience of actually genuinely apprehending what is perceived as the intrinsic value of the thing, right? So Augustine famously says, love is, or he's quoted as saying, although it's quite controversial if we can find this in him, love is saying, I will that you are. Anyone who has a child or has a genuine affection for something or someone else has had this experience of just standing in awe of the person and just watching them. Or when you put down a book that you've been teaching, you just are completely in love with this book. You know, we've done this with many books. And you just, you know, you've done like 2 weeks of teaching this book or whatever, and you sit there and you're like, this is a truly amazing thing, you know? That's what I mean, that the object itself merits this, draws it out of you. In a way, you don't do the love. The love is drawn out of you by your perception of the thing. Now, if all the virtues, all these languages of moral exercise, of moral agency, are forms of this kind of passive responsiveness to reality, you can see how that would reverse typical pictures of agency, where no longer am I doing good, I am responding to the thing that's good. And if you actually ask, it's an interesting thing, if you actually ask people in situations of remarkable moral heroism, the guy who jumped into the New York subway, Lenny Skoltnick, the guy who jumped into the Potomac in 1980, these people describe themselves not as saying, oh, I'm going to do this great thing. They're like, I saw someone in danger, and it wasn't like I even thought about it, right? This lack of agency in these kind of weirdly heroic moments is, I think, a really important phenomenological bit of evidence on Augustine's side about the sovereignty of perception and responsiveness, not ex nihilo action on the part of humans. Anytime you get a picture of ex nihilo action, right, at least for Augustine, as I'm reading Augustine, we're beginning to get into dangerous areas of superbia, of a problematic imitatio Dei, right? Sicut Deus. You're beginning to look like God. You want to act like God. You want to start your own universe. So instead, Augustine wants to redescribe the ethical life as a matter fundamentally of responsiveness. That's why the virtues are forms of love. And of course, all loves turn out to be love of God. Now, this is, as I said, there's an interesting fight here with Thomas Aquinas, who did seem, in contrast to Augustine, to affirm a distinct kind of, roughly distinct sphere of autonomous moral reality that has some real integrity, distinct from, in some abstract way, distinct from theological views of a person. So that in a way you can have pagan virtue. I see that you guys are going to get Jennifer Hurt here in a little while, and Jennifer's really wonderful on this. I think she and I disagree, but the question of pagan virtue is a really interesting question in this. And that is also a topic that could be really fun at an undergraduate level, right? This is a really rich question. Now, let me move on from that into this third thing, because if the self is prompted by God and governed by loves, this suggests that we are not fully ourselves yet, because God has not been finished with us, nor are we properly loving, for Augustine. This is why I have this fourth thing here, a kind of apophatic eschatological anthropology, which culminates in a kind of deification. And I have here, actually, two quotations from sermons, and then this really interesting text, which was kind of sort of meant as a more popular text against the Pelagians. I will not, I'll not take a lot of time with these right now, but they are each really surprising things for a bishop to say. In the first one, he says to newly baptized Christians on Easter morning, he's saying, when you see the sacraments on the table, you are affirming the mystery of Christ. And in seeing and affirming the mystery of Christ, as part of the body of Christ, you are affirming the mystery that you are. So you are participating in a mystery. You have become the mystery, which is an interesting way of thinking about the church, to become a mystery. And the last one is also another attempt, as I said before, rhetorically to try to put more moral pressure on his congregation, to call the saints heaven, right? To say that, in fact, heaven is here among us now is a very interesting thing to do to a congregation of people who have probably, most of them, never bathed in their lives. We know from Augustine's sermons, he would say, I've preached too long, the stink in here is almost unendurable. You know, we're talking North Africa, it could be July, they weren't really well ventilated, it's not going to be pretty. Imagine someone basically in a horrible, something that smelled really bad, saying, this is heaven. Like, look around you. This is what heaven is. And that's an astonishing and strange way of trying to come across and shock people into thinking about their faith again. Again, pressing on the intellectual obligations of being a Christian, pressing on the idea of what it means to be a Christian as genuinely gripping your existential being at the moment. The middle one is interesting to me because it's a great example of something that the scholar R.A. Marcus has called Augustine's vigorous defense of Christian mediocrity. Marcus reads the Pelagian controversy, which most of us think about as grace and free will, as at least equally about whether or not you could be a lousy Christian, or whether, in fact, being a lousy Christian meant you were no Christian at all. And Augustine wants to say that Pelagius is really trying to be a spiritual, a personal trainer to the elites of Rome, and play out a kind of spiritual exercise model of Christianity, where you really have to be serious about this, right? You have to engage in all the right kinds of practices. You have to believe all the exactly right kinds of things, and you have to kind of do this at a kind of proper and politically adroit level. And Pelagius was largely tied in to very elite circles, as was others of Augustine's acquaintance, such as Jerome. He wasn't, though, a bishop. And Augustine really plays with the sense that bishops, this became problematic with Julian later, but for Augustine, bishops are the people who have to deal with the whole mass of humanity. And it looks like, for Augustine, we know this from Confessions forward, all sorts of people who would not be seen as acceptable in proper Roman company are going to get into heaven. Right? This is what you could call the Flannery O'Connor moment in Augustine. Remember that? Is it in Everything That Rises Must Converge, where she sees the whole horde of idiots and losers going up to heaven? Augustine could have written that story. That's Augustine's picture of the church. These are mediocre people. They're lousy. But, and look at the end of this middle passage, 4 lines up from the bottom of this passage, but they have faith in God, from which they live and in accord with which they praise God for the good they do, right? In other words, reorienting who earns the merit for this, and blame themselves for their evils because they have not appropriated God's love properly. In this life, God loves them for their good acts and indulges their evil, and in the next life they'll be freed and with Christ reign forever. And his description of what they do, sometimes they have sex with their spouses and they actually enjoy it. They don't do it to have kids. I mean, there's this weird thing where he's saying stuff and you're like, but you, in the good of marriage, you say this, but here you're being much more tolerant. What's going on? And it's an interesting moment. Anyway, all of this raises the question of if the church is a practice of coming to inhabit this mystery in a very, to my mind, quite tolerant of foibles and failures way, as long as forgiveness is exercised, confessed, sins are confessed, and people are continually trying to be better. How does this community live in the world? And this is the next section. This is number 5, the church during the world. This first line is, I think, a really rhetorically interesting one to think about for Augustine in general. The world itself can be our desert, and the true Christian is a hermit after baptism, if they understand what they have accepted. Right? Saeculum autem hoc eremus est. Right? The world, the saeculum itself, can be our hermitage. Typically, when people think about the saeculum, for Augustine, for complicated reasons, we think that the world is a place that's kind of de-theologized. It's a space that exists and we have to tolerate it. But in some important way, we don't actually thoroughly inhabit it. And this ties into a larger picture of Augustine as anti-worldly. I think he's not anti-worldly at all. I think, in fact, the thing about the world is what creation has fallen into, but the world will be called back to be creation. And the eschaton will be redeemed humanity's reception of the world as creation, as the proper home we were supposed to inhabit all along. And in the meantime, the world itself, as he says here, can be our desert. We can all be monastics. Right? There was this huge tension in the antique world about those people who are serious Christians, this is going back to the Pelagius thing, and those people who are just kind of, they're like, fans when Christianity is high in the rankings and not so good when they're low, like most sports fans. Augustine is saying that's not the way it has to be. In fact, people in the world can live as holy and as sanctified a life as people who are in a monastery off in the desert. And part of Augustine's aims in his own work, in his own ecclesial work, by moving his monastery, when he moved from where he was in Tagaste, when he became bishop, he brought his monastery to Hippo. And he didn't put the monastery outside of the city. He put it in the middle of the city, right next to the cathedral. The monastery is in the city. Right? It's not off in the wilderness, which was unusual for the late antique world. Normally you want to flee the world in order to be a monastic. Augustine says it's better to be in the world. Right? And so he says here, this means, of course, that the whole life of a Christian, as he says, is a holy longing. And Christian faith will be training in longing. Says this again in a set of sermons, homilies. And then he says this astonishing thing in one of the new, this is one of the new sermons actually that was discovered in the 80s, was it by Dolbo? He says, we should not be hoping, he's talking about the martyrs, we shouldn't be hoping for the kind of persecution which our ancestors endured, but the world doesn't give up. There's no let up in the multitude of trials and temptations. Sometimes you're suffering from a fever and you're fighting in the arena. You're weak and you're battling away and you're winning. Don't count yourself as not being a martyr. Your feast day is not indeed in the calendar, but your crown is ready, waiting for you. How many martyrs have left this world from their beds, and as conquerors over that infirmity, have passed to the realms above? Right. This is an enormous, I don't want to say democratization of the sacred, but it's an enormous burden on ordinary people to understand their lives as sanctifiable. And this is, I think, an interesting thing. Again, this goes back to that idea I mentioned of Cavadini about refusing to distinguish in a radical way between the elite who know and the popular who are kind of like lost. He says everybody has to become sanctified in this way. And in our context, I think that's quite attractive as a picture of what the Christian life could be. And again, makes Augustine have a purchase on ordinary students that would be hard for some other people to have a purchase on. Furthermore, if you want more on this, there is a wonderful essay by Michael McCarthy called An Ecclesiology of Groaning, where McCarthy points out that Augustine seems to talk about the church as that community most fundamentally where people groan. The church is not a triumphant community. At UVA, we have a Protestant evangelical group called the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. And a lot of evangelical Christianity, Protestant Christianity, and this is not to mock this, but it's often a language of success, of accomplishment, of achievement. Everyone's great. Everyone's a winner. For Augustine, that's not the church, right? The church is a collection of losers. But it's a collection of losers who have glommed onto their loserness and are trying to do something about it and are grateful for the ways that God is helping them collectively, and they are helping each other collectively to be better, to not be quite so grotesquely losers as they would otherwise be. And that, as a shift in rhetoric, is, I think, tremendously interesting. He says at one point, Christians must be as mendicants, begging constantly for forgiveness in this life. Now, this language of loserdom does open up a kind of Nietzschean critique of Christianity, or at least Augustinian Christianity, which I think is worth keeping in mind. And I think, of course, Nietzsche knew this. Nietzsche really loved Augustine, precisely because Augustine walked right towards him, arms wide open, while Nietzsche was just kind of twirling the Louisville Slugger right there in his hands. But Augustine doesn't, I think Augustine's quite clear on this. I think they were Nietzscheans in Augustine's own time. And so number 6 here is an example of one of the places where Augustine says something shocking about how disruptive Christianity ought to be to our ordinary received patterns of living. And he says here, what great violence is necessary in order that a man may love his enemies and hate his father, mother, wife, and children and brothers. But Christ commands both things when he calls us to the kingdom of heaven. And that's an interesting fact, that we don't actually put those two obligations in tandem much, but it's an interesting way to start a class. And I've actually started a class once by saying, what kind of religion would it be that would ask you to hate your family and love your enemies? Right? But in a way, you get that. That's in Matthew. That's in Luke. This is not hard to see. It's all over the place. Augustine's point there is not to say that in some sense we need to flee this world, escape all of our attachments in this world. He reads those texts as identifying for him a really quite radical tension between the world that we inhabit and the world as it should be. There's a dimension of life, there are dimensions of behavior, let's say, where Augustine can be quite absolutist about the propriety of some things or others. Lying is a good one. Interestingly, a continual insistence on seeking mercy for people who are in prison is another one, even your enemies. And Augustine writes to the Roman authorities on multiple occasions, begging them not to put to death, as the law suggests they should, those extreme Donatists who have blinded his own priests by throwing lye into their eyes. The Donatists would go around, some radical Donatists would go around with little bags or containers of chemicals, and if they were able to ambush a priest, they would fling it in their eyes and blind the priest. Right? The typical punishment for this sort of thing, I think, was like 50 lashes with a lead-tipped whip, which would kill you because it would gouge your flesh, and basically you bleed to death, or you'd get an infection and die if you didn't bleed to death. But there are letters from Augustine to various authorities saying, this is the proper punishment, we recognize that, please don't kill them. Christians are not supposed to ask for the deaths of people. So, and I'm about to talk about this, but Bob Dodaro, in his book on Christ and the Just Society and the Thought of Augustine, which is probably the best book on Augustine's political thought for almost 40 years. And I say that having written a book on Augustine's political thought, but Dodaro's is much, much better. Bob makes the point that if you look at Augustine's letters and sermons, you get this astonishing fixation on resisting the Roman authorities' perennial temptations towards execution, towards capital punishment. Even when Augustine knows the people to be killed are slavers. There's a famous new letter, one of the Divjak letters, came out in the 80s, that reports Augustine's interview with a young boy who is enslaved on the quay at Carthage. And he says, or Hippo, maybe that must have been Hippo. And he's writing actually to Alypius, his friend Alypius, who's going to Rome. And he says, the only law we can find here to stop the slavers, because they're slaving in North Africa and then bringing them to the estates in North Italy. The only law we can find to stop the slavers is one that requires that they be lashed with a whip until they die. It's 100 lashes. And he says, we can't use that law. And the slavers know we can't use that law because that will kill them. So your job is to go to the law libraries in Rome, the law courts, and find a new rescript, find another law that we can use to punish the slavers. Because right now, the only laws that we have on the books that we know of are ones we can't use. So they're getting away scot-free. It's an interesting moment. Anyway, so Augustine is actually about some things, lying, and possibly capital punishment, quite wary, quite absolutist. And he expects this absolutism to matter. He expects it not so much practically to change the world. He's not expecting that the world will become peaceful because Christians do this, or that the world will become less full of lies because Christians are compelled to tell the truth. But rather, it will be an evangelically communicative act. That is, for Christians to tell the truth in a world filled with lies will underscore for everybody how riddled with lies our world is. For Christians to resist the temptation to violence will underscore for everybody how visible and quick we are to move to violence in the way that we behave. The difficulty of a Christian life is meant to be, for Augustine, something that brings into view more fully how properly insane the world is that we inhabit. How crazy it is. Remember, this is the famous line about in the Confessions when he's talking about how he was weeping at the story of the death of Dido in Virgil. And he says, you know, I should have been weeping at the thought that here I was, this young boy, being so profoundly misled by these stories. The weeping was fine. The object of the weeping was way off, right? So, someone who is, I don't know, moved to tears by Justin Bieber or whatever today, there should be crying, but maybe not for the reasons that there is. Right? Bieber is nowhere near as soteriologically dangerous as Virgil, I think, but nonetheless. But along with this absolutism in Augustine, there is a kind of care for the world, an actual and genuine concern for the world. Remember this, the world itself can be our desert. The world itself can be that arena for our sanctification through suffering. And this concern for the world is something that is obligated in humans. And the texts that I have under 7 are attempting to get at that. Most famously, this idea in City of God 1927 that he says, justice is something more of the forgiveness of sins than it is the perfection of virtue. It's an astonishing fact to say, it's an astonishing statement for someone to say in late antiquity. Justice is supposed to be about the tranquility of right order. For Augustine, what he's trying to say is that we're never going to get anywhere near the tranquility of right order in this world. All we're going to get near are opportunities for some forgiveness for the manifold wickednesses that the world is suffused by, is riddled by. And then there's this, I included this long passage famously of the judge who must torture, bless you, the judge who must torture the innocent in order to find out the truth about a crime. I find this passage is a really interesting one in City of God 19:6. One of those passages you can use with undergrads, and not only since Abu Ghraib, not only since torture came home for us, but even before that. The question of what it is What are the limits of what an authority could do or should do? Maybe should do, in fact, for Augustine, is really interesting. And yet also, at the end of this wonderful thing where he turns it on the judge, he says, of course the judge has to do this if the judge is wise. He considers a rejection of this wicked, nephos. But then, 5 lines from the bottom of that quote, yet if his necessary ignorance condemns him to torture and punish the innocent, is it a problem if, while he is innocent, he is yet not happy? Augustine's saying, am I supposed to make the judge happy that he's involved in this? That would be insane. How much more considerable and worthy is it when he acknowledges our miserable necessities, hates his part in them, and if he is pious and wise, cries out to God, from my necessities, deliver me. From my necessities, deliver me, famously, Psalm, oh gosh, no, I'm not remembering. Someone should know this. Psalm 40, 35, something 17, 35, 17, I think. I know this. It's a text that whenever it appears in Augustine, it's one of those texts that he uses most thoroughly to think through the difficulties of politics. He thinks about politics as necessity. In my classes where I do this with students, I use the 2 examples of everybody in America, everybody in the world woke up on September 12, 2001 and said, what is the United States going to do? Only one person, George W. Bush, woke up on September 12, 2001 and said, what am I going to do? Whatever you think about President Bush, the bare experience of having to be him waking up that morning is one that I don't think any of us want to have. And yet that was the necessity of his life. He was in the office. He was the person charged with figuring out what to do. You may agree or disagree with the positions he took, right? I will not reveal my own views on this, but you can see why presidents age. Right? Think about being President Obama on January 20th, 2009. A large-scale economic meltdown occurring, crises in Afghanistan, potential war still in Iraq, well, real war still in Iraq. He walks right into this. Right? Those are the necessities of politics. And Augustine is trying to say, the wise person will understand that the most fundamental thing they can do is pray, from my necessities deliver me. Let these things not happen. A British prime minister in the 1950s was asked once what made politics so difficult, and he said, events, dear boy, events. Events is his term for what Augustine is talking about as necessities. But what's interesting is that Augustine reinscribes this difficulty of politics, this difficulty of the political life, back into the liturgy of being a Christian, back into the idea that you are constantly begging God for mercy. Deliver me from my necessities. Interesting moment. It's not enough just to do these things. You have to do them in the right way and understand why you're doing them and bemoan and bewail the fact that you're doing them. And yet also, behind that is this really interesting phrase from a letter to Boniface. This is a famous letter in the Just War tradition, where he says to the Comes of North Africa, be a peacemaking warrior. Right? That sounds like something someone in the defense industries would say today. But he means something quite concrete by it. There's a kind of a need to understand war as a kind of pacification for Augustine. But this pacification is not what we normally conceive of as peace. Even the wicked, Augustine will say, seek peace. The true kind of peace is not the peace of triumph. Beware what Augustine will call the peace of the dead, the peace of corpses. True peace, the peace Christians seek, is eschatological. It's the peace that Jesus gives to his disciples, the peace of those who have been resurrected, not the dead. Insofar as we live in this world, we are at war with ourselves, and thus we cannot have this peace. but we know it is out there, and we seek it wherever we can. Hence, the pursuit of peace in this life is, for Augustine, always a partial and conflictual one, and susceptible of tragic defeat. And this gets us to the last one, which is how Augustine conceives of engagement in a pluralistic world at a political level. And the famous metaphor of the two cities and the famous phrase, splendid vices, which seems to be a phrase Augustine actually never uses. We've done various searches on this word in the Sedadoc database and stuff, and there seems to be no place where he says, actually, the Romans just have splendid vices. But this is his understanding. Look at the second thing there I'm saying. Augustine is famous for saying that the Romans did not have true virtue in the city of God, he says. They only had a relatively well-organized pathology. Because they sought glory, and first of all glory for Rome, but then in some sense also glory for themselves. And because they ruthlessly subordinated their many other desires and appetites to that aim, their power and their skill came from that focus around that one thing, the eminent glory of Rome. Right? But as he says here, in the Christians' case, the saints, as opposed to the Roman heroes, he says here, they were not quiet, they did not rest in that glory. In other words, they did not take it for themselves, as if it were the virtue which they sought as their end. Rather, they referred that glory itself to the glory of God, by whose grace they were who they were. And so, there's a setting up here of two pictures of moral life. It's possible to be coherent and quite powerful, but not be at all good. And so sometimes the question is asked of, can you be a virtuous Nazi? Can you be a courageous Nazi? Augustine would say no, but you can be a Nazi who is not afraid of certain kinds of dangers, or has subordinated that fear of those dangers to a certain kind of organized discipline, because they have other goods in view. Right? So because of that, Augustine is actually, unlike someone like Aquinas again, much less comfortable with a language of pagan virtue, but he's able to find a functional analog to how humans can handle and be organized in all sorts of successful ways without playing into that language of a virtue of people who do not believe in God. And this is important for the very first word in there, which is actually I mistyped it. It should be, the last S should be gone. It should be gloriosissimam. And this is actually the very first word of the city of God. And that's an interesting choice for a first word, because as I've said a couple times here, this is in some ways the great compare and contrast book of Augustine's career. It's the great book that attempts to really set up and explain the differences between the two cities, right? The city of God and the city of this world, which he takes to be exemplary with Rome. The values of Rome really do revolve, and Augustine is not the first person to say this. Cicero, Seneca, this goes back, really do seem to revolve for many people around the idea of glory. People do things to get glory. Glory for themselves, glory for Rome, whatever. The very first word of the city of God is most glorious, gloriosissima. But what is it applied to? It's applied to the city of God. Most glorious is the city of God, whether on pilgrimage here on earth or in rest in that heavenly land. He goes on from there. It's an incredibly long sentence. It's like 10 lines long. It's a really interesting sentence. But the point of it that's really interesting is that at the very beginning of this book, where he's contrasting these two value systems, he takes the central value of the rival system and twists it to show how it properly applies to his society. And why is that important? Remember, at the beginning I said, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless till they rest in you. Of course humans want glory. That's another way of talking about adoration, of worship. The problem with the Romans wasn't that they wanted to worship. The problem was merely the object of their worship, right? The idea of glorying the idea of seeking glory. This is a fact about human anthropology for Augustine that is not itself to be shunned. The problem is, what is the object of that glory? The Romans, that is, are in fact, in a curious way, using all the right words. They have all the terms they need, but they're using them all in a broken and bent and warped way. What we have to do is show them, Augustine thinks, and tries to do for 1,000 pages, show them the proper meaning of these terms, where they actually sit, how their grammars are related, what these terms refer to. And so, again, this is actually covered even in the title of the book, The City of God, because up until Augustine, people typically thought of the community of Christians, the church, as a family or a household or a kingdom. But the language, the political language of civitas, which had a Roman Republican resonance in Latin, was not a language that people used to describe the Christian community in any vigorous way. There are a couple passages in Augustine's pre-Vulgate Bible where city is used in this way. And he quotes those passages. But it's quite clear by talking about De Civitate Dei, which is the title of this book. Not Contra Paganos, that's a later edition. It's just De Civitate Dei. It's quite clear he's trying to take terms like city and glory, other terms as well, virtue, goodness, justice, and show these aren't bad terms, but they have to be transformed, transfigured, to be shown to be what they really truly are, what they ought to be. And as a form of kind of cultural criticism, I find that a really interesting thing to do. And that's what he's trying to do in this last passage here I've got. Incomparably fairer is that supernal city where victory is truth, right, not conquest of enemies, where dignity is holiness, not a kind of hyper-starchy indifference to suffering, and where peace is happiness and life is eternity. Right. Augustine again and again sets up these contrasts between people who think they are getting an actual virtue when they're actually getting a distorted simulacra of that virtue. And so when we think about splendid vices, that's what he's trying to talk about. One last thing here. There are many things I haven't talked about, but this one contrast in 1428 is a wonderful one to think about and a very important one for Augustine. Again, some of us think this is in some ways a moment of rhetorical excess, but it's not fair to say it's rhetorical excess and stop at that. There's something deep he's trying to get at here when he contrasts the earthly city, the terrestrial city, which is governed by a love of self, amor sui usque ad contemptum Dei, even to the contempt of God, and the celestial city, which is governed by a love of God carried even to the contempt of self. This contrast he sets up here, he's played with it elsewhere, this tension between self-love and love of God, this tension between an ordinary life in the world, what we consider ordinary, a regular life in the world, or a true life which will look a lot like suffering and pain in this world. Augustine never shies away from these rhetorically extreme moments. He's not afraid of saying, yes, there's a real contrast here. I think in thinking about Augustine, one of the places to think most about his challenge to people today, to us, is moments like this. What would it mean to love God even to the contempt of self? And how much of people's faith, of whatever sorts, faith in America, faith in God, faith in football, faith in Villanova or UVA, faith in their academic careers, some of us have that faith, how much of those faiths are actually simply forms of love of self to the contempt of those faiths? So anyway, that's kind of where I am right now. I'm not sure. Do I have more time, or should I stop now, Brett?
I guess it depends on how much time you would like.
I can't. I was looking at that clock and I realized it stopped.
Yeah.
So I'm a little alarmed.
That might be a sign.
In so many ways.
Yeah. I mean, it would be a good time to maybe wrap if you want to wrap up.
Yeah.
The formal talk.
I've reached basically the end. There's much more to say.
Well,
No
doubt.
Should we have a break?
Yeah. That's what I was trying in terms of filming. This is
3 o'clock, just
where
so
we
you know.
kind of.
That's
stop.
great. Then I should stop here. Let me just say there's much more to say, but I think most importantly, there are many different avenues into kind of exposing students, irradiating them with disquieting dimensions of Augustine's ethics. I've talked about some, but not all by any means. I've not at all talked about the distinction, it's a very important one for him, between enjoying God and using all other things in enjoyment of God, even potentially love of other humans, using that for the enjoyment of God. But there are many things to talk about. The point of this is just to give you a kind of rich range of places in Augustine that are really interesting and that kind of hang together in some systematic whole, at least eschatologically for me, even if I can't accomplish it here, in order to give you a sense of both what I take to be the enormous power of this vision, and also the ways that, in interesting fashion, it can directly threaten some of our most cherished assumptions, some of the most powerful assumptions we have, deepest assumptions we have today. I've found with my students that they find these things both exhilarating and sometimes a little terrifying, disturbing, insulting. And at least for me, that's a good place to begin teaching. So I'll stop.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.